profesional, que es el doctor Clayton, pero voy a presentarles quién es él. El doctor Paul Clayton lidera, entre otros grandes profesionales, un proyecto responsable y muy serio de salud, pero ¿quién es él? Él es summa cum laude en la universidad, cum laude en la formación médica de la Universidad de Edimburgo, expresidente del Foro sobre Alimentos y Salud en Reino Unido, asesor científico principal del Comité de Seguridad de los Medicamentos del Gobierno del Reino Unido, miembro del Instituto de Alimentos, Cerebro y Comportamiento en Oxford, pionero de efectos farmacológicos de los alimentos y los ingredientes botánicos y en cómo afectan a nuestra salud y rendimiento físico. Obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de Edimburgo. Este es el señor que vamos a escuchar hoy, implicadísimo en el tema de la salud y, por supuesto, haciendo extensivo todo aquello que él ha desarrollado para que todos podamos beneficiarnos. Sin más, voy a dejar paso al doctor Paul Clayton. Espero que disfruten tanto como yo lo voy a hacer y en un ratito nos vemos para todas las dudas o cuestiones que tengan. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, and thank you for that welcome introduction. And thank you also to everyone who is joining us tonight. Now, I think that what I will do now is I'll share the screen, if I may, and quickly move on to talking about the relationship between diet, inflammation, and health. And perhaps the most important point to make is that we need to have this conversation because the medical system in its traditional configuration has failed. And the reason for saying that is that our public health is in such bad condition. And I'll quickly go through a few countries, but I could have shown you the results from probably over 100 countries. I'll stick with Australia for the moment because we think of Australians as being a healthy outdoors people. In fact, that's not very accurate. These are based on the Australian government's own figures. And according to their figures, half of all adult Australians have at least one chronic disease. And a quarter of them have 2 or more chronic diseases. This is not a healthy population. If we move to the other side of the world and look at Denmark, very different culture, but a very similar pattern of disease. So here, this is again, Danish government statistics. 2 in 3 adult Danes have a chronic health condition. So this seems to be a little bit worse than the Australian situation, but really it's because the definition is a little bit different. And then if you look at different age groups of Danes, you see that as you increase in age, the numbers of health conditions increase. And this is what we expect to see. This matches our own experience. As people get older, they become sicker. They may start with something like hypertension. They may go on to develop diabetes and then osteoporosis, heart disease, and cancer. This is what we think of as the normal pattern of growing old. I'm based currently in the United States, and of course, America is exceptional. They are exceptional in many ways, and one of those ways is they appear to have the sickest society of all. At least 60%, it's probably close to 2/3 because there's a lot of underdiagnosis, have a chronic degenerative disease. 40% have 2 chronic health conditions or more, and more than half of all older adults have 3 or more ongoing chronic diseases. And trends are extremely negative. This is a very unhealthy population. And this is what we see in all countries that have made the nutrition transition, that have moved on from consuming a traditional diet to eating a modern diet, which typically contains a significant percentage of calories as ultra-processed foods. And these foods are very calorie dense, and that, together with our increasingly sedentary lifestyles, has led to a situation where in all of these developed nations, you can see that people and populations in general are getting heavier. Not necessarily a bad thing, you might think, but along with increasing overweight comes an increased risk of many different diseases. Starting at the bottom, early death increases. But if we go back up to the top of the list, NIDDM, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, or type 2 diabetes, you can see that the risks increase very considerably, from 1 at normal weight to 12 times the risk as you move through the obese classes to obese class 3. And along with that, increased risks of heart failure, hypertension, arrhythmias, strokes, asthma, osteoarthritis, and indeed a kind of acceleration of the aging process. The diabetic is exposed to considerable glycative and oxidative stress, and this seems to, as I said, accelerate the aging process, increasing the risk of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, renal, hepatic, peripheral neuronal problems, dementias, to the extent that the average life expectancy of the diabetic is cut by between 4 to 6 years. As I said, an acceleration of the aging process. And the problem is that the numbers of people presenting with overweight, obesity, and diabetes are trending upwards, steadily upwards. They've been increasing more or less every 10 or 15 years or so. And because this is a condition that increases the risk of non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, end-stage renal disease, these conditions are proliferating also. For example, non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, which starts with an infiltration of lipids into the liver, progresses to hepatic inflammation and cirrhosis, and can eventually move towards liver cancer, now affects more than 65 million people in the United States alone. If we look at another symptom of metabolic imbalance, hypertension, you can see that approximately half of current the situation, this is USDA figures, half of US adults have hypertension, and another 10 to 15% have pre-hypertension. So that's about 65% altogether. There's a lot of underdiagnosis here. It's probably more like 3/4 of all adults now have a degree of hypertension. And it's probably close altogether to between 50 and 60% of adults in the United States who have either clinical type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, which is the preclinical precursor. Not only are we seeing more diabetes, but it's happening in younger and younger groups of patients. When I went to medical school in 1968, I was taught that type 2 diabetes was a disease of old age. Of course, that's no longer true. We routinely see diabetics in their 30s, 20s, teens, even preteens. And because we're seeing more diabetics and because they're younger, we're seeing the complications associated with diabetes also appearing in younger age groups. So cataracts is one. The cataract caused by glycation of proteins in the lens of the eye, which diabetics are very prone to because of their hyperglycemia. The age of onset has fallen by about 20 years. And this is a very typical pattern. Almost all of these diseases are increasing in frequency and they're decreasing in latency. We're seeing them in younger and younger patients. The same thing is true for many of the neurodegenerative diseases. So the numbers of patients presenting with neurodegenerative diseases culminating or presenting in dementia has increased by about 250% since 1950. And people are presenting with dementia at younger age groups. And this is a really interesting statistics here, that people are becoming demented earlier. Since 1980, really in the last generation, the age at which patients are becoming demented has fallen by 15 years. Really, that's an alarming statistic. And because people are becoming demented earlier in life, and because we have no treatments for these, once you have been diagnosed, the condition tends to get worse until death. We're seeing increased numbers of deaths. And in the over 75-year group, the numbers of neurodegenerative deaths have increased by 300% in men and 500% in women. Now, I'll talk about depression now because depression is rather closely linked to the dementias. We used to think of depression as a sort of a benign intermittent condition. You have the blues, you get better. We now think of depression as a neuroprogressive disorder. That is, each episode of severe depression causes a degree of neuronal damage, and it is associated with an increased risk of developing dementia in later life. And depression too is increasing. It's been doubling with each generation for the last 2 generations at least. And in parallel with the increasingly young age of people presenting with these conditions, the age of the beginning of depressive illness, the average age has fallen by 16 years since 1988. So it's falling very much in parallel with the age of onset of dementia. We're going to see more dementia in our very near future because depressive illness is a risk factor, as is obesity, which increases the risk up to 300%. Now, neurodegenerative diseases, AD and PD, and of course they're the main two, but there's several others, constitute a huge burden on public health care, but that is only going to get worse. For the sake of fairness and transparency, I will say that the Alzheimer's Cohort Consortium is reporting a negative trend, but because the factors that are driving this pandemic are increasing, I think that that negative trend that has been seen in some areas is very soon going to be reversed. So there appears to be something in our environment which is increasing the risk of neurodegenerative disease in old age. Something in the environment is also increasing the risk of neurodevelopmental conditions at a very early age. And the evidence indicating an increased risk in spectrum disorders is coming through loud and clear. So our brains are being adversely affected at the beginning and at the end of life. The question that we should ask ourselves is what is that doing to us who are still in the prime of our lives? Well, I'm way past it now, but many of you are. How is it affecting you? I'll come back to that in a minute. But let me quickly jump now from neurodegenerative diseases to diseases affecting musculoskeletal tissue, connective tissue disorders. Osteoporosis, there's evidence that the frequency of osteoporosis is increasing, and it seems to be presenting in younger groups of patients. This is partly based on the work of Chris Obrandt, who has been looking through Swedish databases, which are very good in this area, and he's been documenting the increase in low-impact fracture, evidence suggesting that the quality of our bones is not as good as it used to be. And there is evidence also for a deterioration in the quality of our cartilage. We're seeing a hugely increased demand for hip and knee replacements, which is partly to do with the fact that we're getting heavier, we're loading those joints more, but there is some evidence for impaired cartilage chemistry also. Moving across to a different disease area, diseases involving the immune system. The allergies, all of them have increased tremendously. So asthma has increased by 250% in the last 20 years. And it's not just asthma, but all of the other allergic conditions, allergic dermatitis, rhinitis, for example, dermatitis, all of those have increased. And then you have the eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders, which you can think of as almost like asthma affecting the gastrointestinal system. Those conditions have increased as well. And then you have the autoimmune diseases all the way through from RA to MS to Graves to Hashimoto's. There's lots of them, over 100, and most of them seem to be increasing also. Cancers, they've increased as well since 1950 in age-matched groups. The frequency has doubled, and we're seeing it emerging in young patients too. I'll come to that in a minute. One cancer in particular, non-tobacco.
En particular, el cáncer de pulmón no relacionado con el tabaco se ha doblado desde el 2012, que es un incremento tremendamente significativo. Aquellos que son oncólogos saben que es
cancer, relatively small in numbers, but the trend is wildly significant. And this is not because we're getting older as a population. In fact, we're losing life expectancy, and I'll come to that later, because we see the same increase in cancer in teens and young adults. And one cancer in particular, bowel cancer, in 22 to 37-year-olds, and in oncological terms, that's a relatively young age group that has quadrupled since 1974. Again, this is not numerically a very important cancer. You don't see huge numbers of this in that age group, but the quadrupling in a short period of time is eye-watering. And it tells you as well that something untoward is going on. Now, for those of you who don't have any of these conditions, I don't want you to feel too complacent about it. because all of those chronic degenerative conditions that I've been listing, all of them have long latency periods, long preclinical phases. So they tend to be very slowly progressive, and for most of the lifespan of the disease, it's actually pre-symptomatic, it's under the surface. So you can lose bone for decades before you finally fracture. You can lose cartilage in weight-bearing joints for decades before you become painful, limitation of movement, and before you realize that there is an issue and go to your doctor. The same is true for NASH, which is a progressive degenerative disease of the liver, which will move in the fullness of time to cirrhosis and possibly more serious problems. If you're eating an unhealthy diet, which most of us do now, you find when you look at people who appear to be healthy on the surface, that 1 in 5 of them already have the signs of progressive liver disease. You can see here that 1/4 of them, is the second column of osteopenia, are moving towards osteoporosis. 1/5 of non-diabetic adults are moving towards essential hypertension and coronary artery disease. If you add diabetics into that group, it's more like 1/2. About 1/5 of healthy middle-aged adults already have age-related cognitive decline. They haven't yet forgotten their children's names, but they're moving in that direction. And shockingly, almost 1/2 of relatively young adults are showing symptoms of pre-frailty. That is, they're moving towards sarcopenia, metabesity, insulin resistance, the whole world of problems, and serious health problems ensue. Now that we think of this as part and parcel of getting older, but in fact, this is not true. A lot of this is an artifact, because when we look at vestigial groups, these are people who are eating traditional diets and living traditional lifestyles, for example, hunter-gatherer lifestyles, we find that in young adults, in that population, if one of them is killed in a hunting accident and we investigate them, we find, unlike the situation today in populations in developed nations, almost all of them whom have fatty streaks in the linings of their arteries, that is the beginnings of coronary artery disease. In young vestigials, that doesn't happen, they don't occur. You don't see the traditional age-related rise in blood pressure in vestigials. You don't see increasing BMI. You do not see progressive insulin resistance. In short, many of the signs and symptoms of the aging process that we think of as inevitable because we see them all around us are not inevitable. They are artifactual. And I'm going to try and persuade you in the course of this presentation that they are because we are being chronically intoxicated by the modern ultra-processed diet. Getting harder to get this message across, though, because we're all of us becoming more stupid. IQ is falling. And this is the results of a huge meta-analysis carried out, as you can see, at the universities of Hartford, Ulster, and Brussels. And since 1950, there has been a slowing of certain types of reaction time, which equate to a fall of average IQ of approximately 15 points. That continues all the way through to 2020 there. And since then, there's been some preliminary information which indicates that the decline in intelligence is still occurring. And it's driven, as I'm going to show you, by the same factors that are causing the increasing problems with all of those other degenerative, non-communicable conditions that I described. I think that's a fairly existential problem. Does it matter? Possibly not, because we're also becoming less able to reproduce. Another huge meta-analysis looking at sperm counts, and as you can see, in most parts of the world, they are declining, and since 1970, there has been an almost 60% decline, and this has been shown to be true in intranational and international studies. This is a very widespread problem, and we are seeing increasing numbers of men who are presenting with subclinical infertility and overt infertility. We already know that this problem is very widespread in women. It's happening equally in males, and on current trends, within 20 to 30 years, we're going to see an absolute collapse in fertility rates and an unmanaged population decline, unmanaged meaning chaotic. I think that's something we should try to avoid if we can. In the background to this, we're seeing a significant fall in testosterone levels. This is Norwegian data, and I think highly reliable. Men are becoming less masculine, and actually for quite separate reasons. There, because of PCOS, you might say that women are becoming less feminine. There is a kind of endocrine convergence taking place, which does not bode well for us as a species. Our cells and tissues appear to be undergoing an abnormal and accelerated range of aging. And for those of you who are interested in this, many of the subsystems that appear to drive the aging process have been recognized, and I won't go through all of these unless someone wants to ask a question about this later. But the point I want to make is that the presence of increased inflammatory mediators is closely associated with almost all of these and undoubtedly contributes to the majority of them. And it's probably the easiest area where we can intervene, both in terms of personal health management and in terms of the improvement of public health. And this has been acknowledged by the US Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, who look through this metadata year after year after year, and every year they come up with pretty much the same conclusion, that the reason why more of us are dying prematurely worldwide, the reason is poor diet. And one of the reasons why poor diet is damaging so many of us is it drives this, which is chronic inflammation. Now, you need to have acute inflammation. Of course, that's one of your defenses against pathogens and injuries. But once you have chronic inflammation, this starts an insidious process of progressive tissue damage, which I'll go into later. Now, for those of you who are into the chemistry and mechanics of chronic inflammatory stress, you'll be more than familiar with all of this. But I'm not going to talk about what's happening inside the cell. This is a very simplified version, obviously, of the chronic inflammatory process. I'm going to talk about what happens outside the cell, the immune cell, in this case, a macrophage, or it could be a neutrophil. And I'm talking about the inflammasome. That is what happens outside the cell. It's between the activation of the cell and subsequent accumulative tissue damage. So not to be mistaken with the inflammasome. Most of you know what is the inflammasome, and that is something that is where biochemistry starts to impact very directly on public health. So here's a schematic of your cell membrane. It's a phosphatidyl phospholipid bilayer, those two parallel tramlines across the top of the slide. And incorporated into the cell membrane, you will have a fatty acid profile, which corresponds to the fatty acid profile of your diet. So in the membranes, you will have phosphatidyl phospholipids containing omega-6s, such as arachidonic acid. That's over on the left, and over on the right, omega-3s, such as EPA and DHA. Now you need to have the right proportions of those fatty acids in your cell membranes, because this is really where the inflammatory cascade starts. Along comes an inflammatory challenge, which could be a pathogen, it could be a physical injury. And of course, we need to be able to defend ourselves and respond to that. And we need to do so by mounting an acute inflammatory response. The omega-6 fatty acids are absolutely essential here because they start the process of inflammation by breaking down your enzyme PLA2 comes in there, and then you've got these pro-inflammatory eicosanoids and cytokines, and they start driving the inflammatory reaction until the microbe that caused the trouble to begin with, or the broken down tissue has been neutralized or removed. And at that point, once the threat has been dealt with, you need to stop the inflammation sequence, and that's where the omega-3s come in. They're producing anti-inflammatory eicosanoids, and you can see PGE3, TXA3, LTA5. They're also producing resolvins, protectins, maressins, which are helping to resolve the inflammatory response, and now the situation is stable. And you need both of those because it's, again, this is a metaphor I use very frequently. It's like the accelerator and the brake on a car. As you're negotiating your way through heavy traffic, you need both. You need to be able to react appropriately to different situations, oncoming traffic, pedestrians jumping into the road in front of you, whatever. It's the same when you're trying to negotiate the hazards of life. Microbes, tissue damage, they're coming at you all the time. You need to be able to start an inflammatory response, an acute inflammatory response.
Responder a una inflamación aguda y detenerla una vez la amenaza se neutraliza. Esto es una situación homeostática, es sana y es absolutamente esencial. El problema es que demasiados de nosotros bioquímicamente y nutricionalmente estamos configurados de forma tal que somos proclives a la inflamación crónica y necesariamente no es que sea algo bueno. La cascada inflamatoria es muy compleja. Voy a
Ich möchte eine sehr, sehr vereinfachte Version davon hier.
Vamos a ver el inicio y el fin de la cascada inflamatoria. Al principio tenemos la contribución que se integra dentro del sistema a través del ratio de omega 6 y omega 3 en nuestras membranas celulares, que si lo recordamos bien refleja la proporción de esos ácidos grasos en la dieta. Una vez ya se nos desencadena esta respuesta, si tenemos una relación de 6:3, un ratio de 6:3 muy alto, tenemos una sobreregulación, una regulación a la alza de los genes que codifican las metaloproteinasas, y esto pues también genera unos exosomas polvo celular. Si tenemos muchos 6 y pocos
diet, which is now normal, you're constantly releasing these exosomes. They have matrix metalloprotease enzymes in them, and they contribute to substantial tissue destruction. These are very, very destructive enzymes. Now, that's not the end of the story, because there are other compounds in the diet, in a healthy traditional diet, which damp the activity of these enzymes. They do two things. In fact, they downregulate the genes which code for those enzymes, and they actually block the enzymes locally, a classic enzyme inhibitory reaction by binding to the divalent metal cations at the active site of those enzymes. So if you have the right 6:3 balance, and your diet also contains polyphenols, and a traditional diet is going to give you that, you will be able to have effective acute inflammatory responses to keep you healthy, but you won't have chronic inflammatory stress, which is what makes so many of us sick. Once you make that nutrition transition and you're starting to eat too many ultra-processed foods, your 6:3 ratio goes way up from about 2 or 3 to 1, which is what we find in traditional diets, to an average of 15 to 1 in the EU and 25 to 1 in North America. So now the first chamber in this inflammatory cascade is overheating. If you're eating that modern diet, the polyphenols have been largely removed as well, which means that the last step in the inflammatory cascade is also overheating. So now you're releasing too many of these very destructive matrix metalloprotease enzymes into the tissues. Whichever tissues are affected, it could be joint, cartilage or bone, it could be the linings of your arteries, it could be inside your skull. And it starts to break down this. This is the extracellular matrix. Now this is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that runs through every cubic micrometer of your body, and it holds all of your cells together so that they are correctly in the right configuration, so that they can coordinate with each other and function collectively as a tissue or indeed as an organ. And these fibers, there's 7 or 8 different types of collagen, but there's other proteins such as elastin and laminectin, and then you have composite microfibers such as proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans. So this is a very, very complex web of fibers. Different proportions of these fibers in different parts of the body, depending on what the local physical and physiological requirements are. But the important thing to note is those matrix metalloprotease enzymes break all of them down. They break down the collagens, the elastins, the hyaluronic acid, the glycosaminoglycans. They break all of this down. And once that structure, this microstructure, has been dissolved, your tissues turn effectively to soup. The cells can no longer communicate with each other. They start to die. It's an incredibly hostile environment for them. And this leads to slow, progressive loss of healthy and functioning tissue. Now, if you've heard of these enzymes before, and you may well have done, it's because they are the same enzymes that are released by the so-called flesh-eating bacteria, almost identical. And if you're unlucky enough to expose to an infection caused by flesh-eating bacteria, they're producing large amounts of these enzymes in very short periods of time, and they dissolve you. It's like being thrown into an acid bath. They dissolve skin, ligaments, fascia, bone, cartilage. And it is these same enzymes that are being released in much smaller amounts over much longer periods of time, over decades, that lead to the slow destruction of cartilage and bone and arterial lining that we call osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, and coronary artery disease. And I could go through the whole list of chronic degenerative diseases. This is the key. The problem is our nutritional intakes have changed really very drastically. According to all the different data sets that are available, our 6:3 ratio was probably within 3:1, 4:1, 5:1 until about 1900 on average. Then it starts to change because seafood becomes more difficult to obtain. The food industry starts to produce stabilized plant oils and put them into all their processed foods, and the 6:3 ratio starts to climb until it's now, as I said, in Europe, 15:1, North America, 25:1. And our intakes of polyphenols have declined as well because we're simply eating less fruits and vegetables than we did 100 years ago because of our very low levels of physical activity. And because of the shift from heirloom varieties to modern varieties of fruits and vegetables, which contain far lower levels of these phytoalexins or phytonutrients. From the data that's available to us, it looks very much as if our intakes of polyphenols have dived by approximately 90%. So it's been an order of magnitude decline in our intake of these powerful and really important anti-inflammatory nutrients. Thanks to the good work of the food multinationals, and it's a very small number of them, from names I think you're probably more than familiar with, who collectively dominate the global food space. Now, none of these foods are toxic in the acute sense, but if you eat too many of these foods for too long a period of time, it will make you sick and it will kill you because it's highly pro-inflammatory. It's got a terrible omega-6 to 3 ratio because soy oil is the one single food ingredient, as well as sugar, that has increased the most proportionately in our diets in the last 100 years. The polyphenols have gone. Omega-3s have gone. So two key anti-inflammatory nutrients have been abstracted from the diet. And then the food companies take away prebiotic fibers, 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, and these are also really important anti-inflammatory nutrients. So the top 4 anti-inflammatory nutrients that are normally present in a traditional diet have gone. And in their place, what the food industry does, they give us very significant amounts of advanced glycation end products, advanced lipoxidation end products, and lipopolysaccharides. And again, this is rather detailed stuff, but it's to do with the way in which they process these foods and preserve them. And all of these are highly pro-inflammatory. So the anti-inflammatory compounds have gone, whole new rafts of pro-inflammatory compounds. You can begin to see where the problem lies. It's exacerbated by an enormous increase in our intake of sugar, which is hidden in the most unlikely places. Ketchup is actually a third glucose by weight. You think Coke is bad, that's 10%. Ketchup is actually 30%. And our intakes of sugar have increased from about 4 to 5 pounds per person per year in 1820 to close to 100 pounds of sugar per person per year today. Now, if you do the math, 100 pounds of sugar contains, and if you're assuming a metropolitan person is utilizing 2,000 calories a day, 100 pounds of sugar is going to give you most of the calories that you need for the first 3 months of every year. That's how significant the numbers of totally empty calories are. And you add in soy oil and corn oil as well, which are hugely important constituents in all of our ultra-processed foods. And the numbers of calories, empty calories, we are now consuming has become really very significant indeed. So our calorie intake has gone up, our nutrient intake has gone down. And because these types of food are typically have really the wrong electrolyte ratios, too much sodium, not enough magnesium, not enough potassium, add that to chronic inflammation, now you have essential hypertension, and you have all kinds of other complications as well. So this is a diet that causes disease. It causes the diseases of civilization. Now, it's driving chronic inflammation, which accelerates the rate of destruction of tissue, and at the same time, it starves of micronutrients, causing something called type B malnutrition, which means you're not able, as effectively as you should be, to replace and heal that damaged tissue. Now, this is type A malnutrition, which you'll find in the medical textbooks, and it sort of looks like that. That's not what we see today. We see type B malnutrition, characterized by people who have enough and maybe too many calories. But because we're eating relatively little, historically speaking, and because so many of those foods are ultra-processed and they have a very low nutrient density, people are low in almost everything right across the board. Many of the classical micronutrients, the vitamins, the trace elements, but also the omega-3s, the prebiotic fibers, the carotenoids, the polyphenols, the xanthophylls, the methanogens, the cyanogens. We're low in absolutely all of them, and you look like that. So if you're eating a diet of hamburgers, shakes, and fries, you have inflammatory stress, you have type B malnutrition, you have dysbiosis as well. And that's why these children are absolutely unhealthy. They don't know it yet, but they're already growing in their bodies the seeds of those degenerative diseases, which in a few decades' time will emerge as essential hypertension, or metabolic syndrome, or the beginnings of osteoporosis, of osteoarthritis, a neurodegenerative condition. What is ultra-processed food? I've sort of referred to that. The most commonly used definition is the NOVA definition. Processed foods are basically recognizable. Looking at them, you can see what's in them. Ultra-processed, one part of the definition is 6 ingredients or more containing ingredients that you can't buy in a store, such as acidulants, stabilizers, emulsifiers, typically sugar-sweetened beverages like Coke, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, candy, ice cream, breakfast cereals, all of those kinds of things, all the things we like to eat. And it's really bad for you because they don't satiate. Very little fiber. You eat too many of them, typically 500 more calories a day than if you were eating basic produce. So you get heavier. It results in long-term weight gain. But you're gaining that long-term weight on empty calories, very low nutrient density, and it creates this paradox. So that the heavier you are, actually the worse your nutritional status is. So these people look as if they're well-fed, overfed. In fact, internally and nutritionally speaking, they are starving. This is the reason why the more ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you tend to die. So a 10% increase in consumption of these delicious ultra-processed foods is associated with a 10% increase in the risk of cancer, a 15% increased risk of type 2 diabetes, and a 14% increase of early death. And there's a dose effect relationship. The more of them you eat, the more you die. And it also accelerates the aging of the immune system. You have more inflammation and you have an increased risk of sepsis. Let me backtrack. This last paper by Napier et al. Is not with people, it's a preclinical study looking at laboratory rats, because these foods, ultra-processed foods, are designed to be delicious and addictive. And guess what? Lab rats like them just as much as we do. They'll eat them if they get the chance. And if they do, they experience exactly the same problems that we do. And this has contributed to a situation reported on, this is a Dutch group, I think at the University of Utrecht, in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology. If you compare the generations, our entire aging process has accelerated. Today's adults are so unhealthy that they are in every sense 15 years older than their parents and grandparents were at the same age. A salutary warning to you all. And it explains why life expectancy is now falling. Been falling for the last 5 years in the United States, for the last 4 in the United Kingdom, and we're going to start seeing it falling in many other countries as well, because these are the countries where people eat the most ultra-processed foods. In the United States, an astonishing 60% of all calories are consumed in the form of ultra-processed foods. Canada is very close behind, Britain at 50.7, and then you see Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Finland. And actually, these figures are increasing as a result of lockdown because more of us are moving towards using comfort foods. People are unhappy, they're stressed, thanks to the idiocy of our politicians, and our diet is actually getting worse. And you can see here what's happening as the multinational food producers roll their compounds out across Europe from east to west and from north to south. Even down in the south, in the Mediterranean range, the Mediterranean diet is beginning to almost disappear. as the multinational food companies continue to press their marketing advantage home. Which is very sad, because the Mediterranean diet is really a healthy option. It's better than going to see the doctor, because if you move onto a Mediterranean diet, you can reduce the risk of many of these degenerative diseases very significantly by between a third and a half. And there's really a huge amount of data to support this. But we now know a diet that's even healthier. And that's important because you need at least 3 data points: OECD, Mediterranean, one other, to show which way the wind is blowing, which way the trends are moving. And the third data point derives from the mid-Victorian experiment, 1850 to 1900 in England, and it was made possible by two things: the agricultural revolution, which hugely increases agricultural productivity; the technical revolution, which then brings the agricultural productivity into the cities where people are working. And they're working with their backs and their hands. It's a blue-collar culture. It's largely working class, and working class really means physical work. We know exactly how hard they worked. All of this has been documented. This was a society that documented itself, not just in lines of script, but also in photographs. It's the beginning of the age of photography, and we know that these people were involved in 60 to 75 hours of physical activity a week on average. Quite different to the way in which we live today. So they're burning huge amounts of calories, and they're not consuming salt, tobacco, spirits, or ultra-processed foods in the way that we do. They're eating a very low 6:3 ratio, lots of polyphenols. It is a very anti-inflammatory diet, and if that means anything at all, it should show up in life expectancy data, and indeed it does. Now, when you compare life expectancy between different periods, you have to be very granular and compare equivalent socioeconomic groups. Mid-Victorian society is basically working class, socioeconomic groups in C to D1. And if you compare mid-Victorian women to the equivalent group today, you can see that women have gained about 3 years. That was in 2006, it's fallen to 2.5 years. But there has been a gain, and that is because of improvements in family planning and gynecology and obstetrics. But look at men. Men have lost 3 years. We've lost 3 years of life expectancy, despite modern medicine, despite modern surgery, diagnostics, and pharmacotherapeutics. We're going backwards, and we're also losing health expectancy. Now, when the Victorians get towards the end of their shelf life, they go into a workhouse, which means exactly what it says. They had to work to pay for their own upkeep, and the records show that they did up until the last days and sometimes hours of their life. When they died very quickly, usually of a fulminating infection. But when we look at the autopsy reports, we see very little signs of chronic degenerative disease. About 10% of the rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and dementia that we see today. And other people have found the same findings. This is a different group of researchers, and here they're comparing causes of death in England and Wales in 1997 on the right, and you can see the bottom 2 columns there are cancers and diseases of the circulatory system, which is pretty much normal. If you go back to the mid-Victorian period, they do exist, but at very, very low levels, about 10% of the levels that we see today. And that tells us, I think, 2 things. Firstly, it tells us that almost 90% of the chronic degenerative disease we see today is avoidable if you get your diet right. Secondly, that figure of 10% is really interesting, because if you ask an oncologist, a cardiologist, a neurogeriatrician, how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors, they'll say about 10%. And we believe that if you go back to 1880, the only people who are developing these conditions are that very small number who have strong genetic risk factors. Everybody else is protected by their extraordinarily anti-inflammatory and healthy diet. Now, I know that we have some oncologists in the audience today, and it seems like a tall order to state that you have a population here that had our life expectancy, but a frequency of cancer that was so much less. Now, I go along with Bruce Ames, and I think that, we're probably developing cancer cells in our bodies all the time, but they're emerging in very different environments. The environment today is cancer friendly. The environment 100 years ago was cancer hostile. So very quickly going through these risk factors, obesity was rare then. We know obesity is cancer promoting. Today it's everywhere. So therefore the Victorian had a neutral profile of adipokines, whereas we today mostly have a pro-inflammatory profile. If you look at NIDDM and metabolic syndrome, you've got hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, you've got various growth factors being pumped out, rare in the Victorian era, common today. A very anti-inflammatory environment. They're eating a very good 6:3 ratio, we're not. They're eating lots of polyphenols and beta-glucans, we're not. So that means we're immunocompromised. We're consuming far more carcinogens than they were. We're using far more tobacco, far more high alcohol drinks. They don't. Cooked meat carcinogens, they hardly contain any at all, because their diet, if they cook meat, it's almost always stewed, i.e. it never gets above 100 degrees. We use frying, grilling, barbecuing, so we're consuming far more of those. And then if you look at phase 2 inducers, which are those compounds that upregulate the enzymes in the liver that help to remove toxins and carcinogenic metabolites from the body, they're eating a lot of those, we're not. And then finally, because they're physically very active and we're not, in that population, AMPK is on, mTOR is off, and with us, it is completely the reverse, creating a cancer-hostile environment in the Victorian and a cancer-promoting environment in today's model citizen. So let's take a theoretical 21st century person, and let's say he's eating a typical ultra-processed diet, which has a very high 6:3 ratio and very little polyphenols. So he has chronic inflammatory stress, which may manifest as an arthritic disorder, as a cardiovascular disorder, progressive liver damage, asthma or COLD, or it could be a migraine, epilepsy, or a neurodegenerative condition. All of these are known to involve chronic inflammatory stress as a driver. And this person is also eating a diet that is very depleted in prebiotic fibers. Therefore, their microbiome is predominantly gram-negative, and they have chronic inflammatory stress in the intestines as well. So what we do, we give them balance oil, which is a blend of omega-3s and lipophile polyphenols, and that damps chronic inflammatory stress very effectively in almost all tissues of the body, except, of course, for the lower intestine. And there we have to manipulate the microbiome, reverse modern dysbiosis, and we do that using a time-release blend of prebiotic fibers, which turns the microbiome from being predominantly gram-negative to being predominantly gram-positive. And I'm not saying that all gram-positive bacteria are good, all gram-negative ones are bad. That's clearly a grotesque oversimplification. But my point is that all gram-negative microbes are gram-negative because they contain lipopolysaccharides in their cell walls. They're highly pro-inflammatory. So by putting prebiotics into the diet, we can reduce chronic inflammatory stress in the large intestine as well, and return it from a pathological to a physiological level of inflammation. And we know we can do this very quickly. Using balance oil, we can bring the 6:3 ratio under 5 reliably within 120 days and shift people from a pro-inflammatory into an anti-inflammatory configuration. We know this because we have an enormous library, I think almost 600,000 samples now of cell membrane fatty acid lipid profiles, by far the largest in the world. And we know that in patients or subjects who don't take omega-3s, in Europe, their average is 14.8 to 1, a figure I mentioned before. People taking classical fish oils, they're not very well formulated. That brings your ratio down to about 10. It's still pro-inflammatory. And this group had the same types of health problems that you see in the no omega-3 group. In other words, taking a classical fish oil has no benefits at all. And this is reflected in the Cochrane collaboration's meta-analytical views. If you use balance oil, very, very quickly, you can bring the average ratio down to about 2.8. And at that point, chronic inflammatory stress simply disappears. Now, bear with me one moment. I just have to transfer to a different PowerPoint because I have a little glitch in the system here. but bear with me. I will be with you in just a moment. And here we are. So this is what's happening inside the large bowel if you're eating a traditional diet, a blue zone diet, traditional diet, lots of prebiotic fibers. And those prebiotic fibers are the preferred substrate for various types of gram-positive microbes, here shown as these little green things floating around. And because they like to eat prebiotic fibers, they stay in the lumen of the gut, they get into the outer mucosal layer, but they tend not to come into direct contact with our colonocytes, and those are the cells along the bottom of the screen. When those bacteria see the prebiotic fibers, they break them down into short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate. And butyrate is a potent anti-inflammatory agent, and it's also very good at killing cancer cells. So this is a very healthy configuration. The conversation between this kind of microbiome and our own cells is entirely healthy. You go through the nutritional transition, you move to a diet which contains lots of ultra-processed foods. Prebiotic fibers have gone. Gram-positive microbes start to die off. They're replaced by gram-negative. Those are the little red bugs here. And gram-negative species, many of them like to eat mucin. So they start breaking down the mucosal layers. They come into direct contact with the cells that line the large bowel. And because they're coated with lipopolysaccharide, now you have huge amounts of chronic inflammatory stress, both locally inside the gut, contributing to IBD and IBS, but also creating a leaky gut situation. I'm sorry, I don't like that term, but it's in fairly wide use. Various bacterial metabolites, undigested food-derived molecules are getting into the bloodstream and causing a very wide range of problems elsewhere. What do we do in this situation? We put prebiotic fibers back into the diet, lower the LPS, increase the butyrate, switch from being inflamed and procancerous to being anti-inflamed and cancer protective. And now, please, I apologize. Bear with me for just a second while I go back to the original PowerPoint. And I will talk about the actual prebiotic fibers that we use. As you can see, they're all carbohydrates. This is a whole bunch of others, which I'll quickly go through. So you have a chain of fructose groups, like beads on a chain, culminating in a glucose moiety. These are not digested. Our enzymes can't digest them. And so they pass through the gut intact, the small intestine, they arrive in the large bowel. There, the gram-positive microbes start to break them down, and they do so one bead on the chain at a time. Because these are very short molecules, the reaction, which is called a fermentation, is very rapid. So we add larger amounts of inulin, the same molecule, but much longer. So that's a slower reacting compound. We add 1316 beta-glucans, 1314 beta-glucans from oats, longer molecules, slower fermentation, and larger amounts of resistant starch or dextrins from sources such as green banana, very complicated molecule, and the bugs can only break this down very slowly. So this is a much slower fermentation. You need to have all of these and in the right proportions, because when this blend of prebiotics enters the large bowel, it's moving. Everything's moving. And so the FOS, the short molecules, are the very first to react. So the fermentation starts to occur in the ascending colon, and then the inulin takes over, and then the 1314 beta-glucans, and finally the resistant starch. It's not as neat as this. It's not one stops and the next one starts. It's not an exact relay race, but that's more or less what's happened. And in this way, we can transform the entire colonic microbiota from being predominantly negative to being predominantly positive, from being pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. Now, according to the World Health Organization, this can reduce early death by 30%. There's the breakdown, very significant. And they say that about 30 grams of fiber a day is where you should start. If you eat more, you get better production. There's a dose-effect relationship. But the problem is people on the whole do not eat nearly enough fiber. The average intake is only half the minimum dose that the WHO recommends. And out of that 15 grams, only a quarter of it, 3.5 grams, consists of the really important prebiotic fibers that are ones that change the microbiota. So what we have done, WHO implies 7 grams, we've doubled that, and it stops chronic inflammation in the large intestines. What can I say? It works extremely effectively. But there's 2 more sources of chronic inflammatory stress that are very important, which we also need to address. And one of those is deep abdominal adipose tissue. The apple shape is dangerous because these deposits of fat become infiltrated with macrophages and they pump out pro-inflammatory messengers. And this fat is close to the heart, the liver, the pancreas. It creates all kinds of problems. So you need to try and stabilize that situation. And you can do that either by taking a lot of physical exercise, which will help to reduce these deep pockets of fatty tissue, or you can stabilize it with a very special group of phyto and micronutrients, which we've put into a product called Xenobiotic, containing tocopherols, tocotrienols, carotenoids, xanthophylls, and lipophilic polyphenols. And that switches off inflammation in the deep adipose tissue as well. But there's one more source of chronic inflammation we should think about, which is periodontal disease, which is a very, very common problem. Now, we know that periodontal disease is associated with an increased risk of many disorders, and we think it's because if you have this dysbiosis in the mouth, microbial toxins are getting into the brain, probably retrograde through the olfactory nerve, and we think this is why that condition in the mouth is associated with an increased risk of strokes, Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism, but you're swallowing these compounds as well, which is why we believe periodontal disease increases the risk of pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, and resistant hypertension. So we are very interested in finding ways of trying to stop this kind of dysbiosis. We have found one, and it comes from the ocean, not from the fish, but from the seaweeds. Now, the first thing you will notice when you pick seaweeds up out of the ocean is how slippery they are, and that is because they are coated with a substance called fucoidan, which is a biological equivalent of Teflon. It is a non-stick substance. And if you eat fucoidans, they are absorbed into the blood, they're secreted in the saliva, and they bathe the roots of the teeth in these non-stick compounds. When that happens, plaque disappears. And you can see that for yourself using plaque disclosing tablets you can get from your dentist. After 2 or 3 weeks, the tartar, which is mineralized plaque, falls off the roots of the teeth. When that happens, inflammation stops, bleeding stops, and some very interesting Japanese work shows that once this situation has been normalized, that teeth which may have been starting to become loose are able to anchor themselves securely back into the gums. So we have a formulation which we are just bringing to the market now, which contains these fucoidans and a couple of other things besides, which stop chronic inflammatory stress in the mouth, which resolve periodontal disease, and then we believe remove the risk factors associated with us. So we believe in testing, we believe in evidence-based nutrition, and we think that you should do a self-test first to see whether you even need any of these things. And then if you do, if you have chronic inflammatory stress, we address that in almost all tissues with this balance of omega-3s and lipid-soluble polyphenols. In the gut, we can help to restore a healthy microbiota using this time-release system of prebiotic fibers. And in deep adipose tissue and in periodontal disease, we have this formulation, which in addition restores and resolves type B malnutrition and contains the 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans and cyanogens that are needed to enable the innate immune system to work optimally. We've covered an awful lot of ground in a very short period of time. I'm sorry to have rushed through this. This is a subject that I would normally, if I was dealing with students, take a week, if not 2, to cover. And we've tried to do everything all at once. So thank you for your patience and my utmost respect to the interpreters who I'm sure have done a wonderful job in conveying this. Now, I hope that there will be time for some questions and answers. And if there is time, I will do my best to answer as many questions as you like.